The city of Abidjan was hot and loud and beautiful. It felt like a place on the rise. For Maya Vance, the Pan-African Summit was just another job. She worked for the State Department, but not as a high-level diplomat. Her role was more like a fixer, a person who knew how things really worked on the ground. She arranged security details, smoothed over logistical nightmares, and made sure the right people talked to each other. She was good at it because she listened more than she talked, and she remembered everything. The summit was a big deal. Leaders from across the continent were here, and so were their security teams, including a unit of 340 United States Marines. They weren't frontline combat troops. They were a Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Team, or FOST. Their job was to be a shield, a highly visible and professional presence securing the perimeter of the conference center. Maya had coordinated with their commander, a serious man with calm eyes named Colonel David Shaw. They had exchanged a few words about helicopter landing zones and motorcade routes. He was all business, and she respected that dot for 3 days. Everything went as planned. Then, on the final night, during a gala dinner, the world changed. It didn't start in Abidjan. It started with news alerts on phones, then frantic calls, then a rising chorus of sirens across the city. A coordinated military coup had erupted in not one, but 3 neighboring countries. Maya's new desk was in a part of the building where the air felt still and recycled. Her job was to write reports on regional political updates, things that were already public knowledge. It was busy work, designed to keep her hands full and her mind quiet. But the quiet was the problem. In the quiet, all she could hear was the static after Colonel Shaw's last message. Awaiting further orders, she started small, almost without thinking. It began with a simple, personal email to an old contact, a man who worked signals intelligence for the National Security Agency. They'd met years ago at a conference. His name was Ben. She didn't ask about the Marines directly. That would raise flags. Instead, she wrote about the general situation in the region, asking for his professional insight. He wrote back a day later with a dry, lengthy analysis of communication patterns. Buried in the 3rd paragraph was a single, interesting line. Localized, encrypted burst transmissions in the border highlands don't match any known junta military signatures. Low power mobile. Puzzles me. It wasn't proof. It was a thread. And Maya began to pull. She remembered a guy she'd met once, a retired Air Force master sergeant who ran a logistics consulting firm. He was a gruff man who loved to complain about bureaucracy. She bought him a coffee. She listened to him complain for 20 minutes about supply chain software. Then, casually, she mentioned the trouble of getting medical supplies into unstable regions. He snorted. "Tell me about it." We had a whole pallet of field trauma kits, just sitting in a private hangar in Senegal for a month. Part of a canceled contract. Just gathering dust. He gave her the name of the hangar, joking she should go steal them. Piece by piece, a whisper network formed. She talked to a journalist she trusted, a woman who'd spent years in Africa. She didn't ask for sources. She just asked, if a large group was trying to stay hidden over there, where would they go? The journalist, over a glass of wine, sketched a rough map on a napkin. "The borderlands," she said, tapping the area where 3 countries met in a tangle of mountains and thick jungle. "No one controls that. It's a smuggler's paradise. If they're smart and they have a leader who knows his stuff, that's where they'd be. But it's a green hell. They couldn't last forever." The most important piece came from a most unexpected place. One of the Marines who had been on the perimeter that night, a young corporal wounded by shrapnel during the initial chaos, had been medevaced out just before the cordon tightened. He was recovering at a military hospital. Maya went to see him, saying she was from State Department debriefing. He was pale, his arm in a sling, but his eyes were fierce. "They're not gone." "Ma'am," he said, before she even asked a real question. He was angry, and the anger made him talk. Colonel Shaw, he had a fallback plan. Always did. We called it the Rainforest Rally Point. If everything went to hell, we were to break into small teams, evade, and regroup there. He looked out the window, his jaw tight. He'd never just let them get captured. He'd take them to ground. I know he would. Maya felt a chill that wasn't from the hospital air conditioning. They were alive. They were out there. And her own government was officially calling them unrecoverable assets. She began to connect the dots in her own apartment at night, a map of the region pinned to her wall. Ben's strange signals were in the same general area as the journalist's borderlands. The sergeant's forgotten medical supplies were in a nearby country. The corporal's rally point was right in the middle of it. She drafted a formal memo to her superiors, laying out the circumstantial evidence, requesting a request for satellite surveillance of the area. Her boss, a kind but weary man, called her into his office. He didn't look at the memo. He looked at her with something like pity. "Maya," he said, his voice low, "you need to let this go. The evidence is not the point," he interrupted, gently but firmly. "The decision has been made, at a very high level. Poking at this, it doesn't help them, and it will certainly end your career. You're making people uncomfortable." That was the moment the mission changed for her. It was no longer about informing the authorities. They already knew, or they had chosen not to know. The official channels were not just closed. They were bricked over. The Marines had been abandoned, not by accident, but by a cold, deliberate choice. The risk of a failed rescue, the political fallout, the potential for an international incident, it was all too great. 340 lives had been weighed on a scale and found too heavy to lift. She left her boss's office, the memo feeling like a burning piece of paper in her hand. The anger that rose in her then was clean and sharp, unlike the helpless fog she'd felt before. They were waiting for orders that would never come. The system had decided they were a cost of doing business. That night, she looked at the map on her wall, at the web of notes and strings. The Whisper Network had given her the truth. Now, she realized, it might have to give her the tools. She thought of the medical supplies gathering dust. She thought of the retired sergeant who knew how to move things. She thought of the journalist's contacts on the ground. She was a bureaucrat. She knew rules, procedures, and paperwork. And for the first time, she saw them not as walls, but as a system she could understand and perhaps, very carefully, take apart. She wasn't a soldier. She couldn't fire a rifle, but she could forge a shipping manifest. She could reroute funds. She could make a phone call to a man who knew a man who flew planes and asked no questions. The path was invisible and fraught with danger. Every step would be a crime. But the image in her mind was clear. Colonel Shaw and his Marines looking at a silent radio, waiting in the Green Hill. The world had told them they were alone. Maya, sitting in her silent apartment, made a new decision. She would have to become the answer they were waiting for. The first rule Maya broke was a small one. She filed for 2 weeks of personal leave. Her boss approved it without looking up, probably relieved she was taking some time. The lie was in the destination. She told people she was visiting a friend out west. Instead, she used her own savings to buy a ticket to Dakar, Senegal. The heat that hit her when she stepped off the plane was different from Abidjan's drier. Dustier, but it carried the same feeling of a world far from Washington's air-conditioned rooms. She found the retired Air Force Master Sergeant, the one who'd complained about the bureaucracy. His name was Tom. He ran his logistics consulting firm from a cluttered office near the port. When she walked in, he didn't seem surprised. Knew you'd come. he grunted, not looking up from the spreadsheet. "The look in your eye at that coffee shop. Trouble." Maya didn't waste time. She laid it out, plain and simple. She told him about the signals in the highlands, the Marine's story about the rally point, the pallet of medical supplies gathering dust in a hangar just a few miles away. Tom listened, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "So you want to steal government property, use it for an unsanctioned rescue mission, and likely get us all thrown in a foreign prison or shot. That about it?" "Yes," Maya said, her voice quiet but steady. He was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the cranes moving containers in the port. "My nephew's a Marine," he finally said. "Not one of those. But he could have been." He turned back to her. "The supplies aren't a problem. They're written off. It's the getting them there. That's the trick. You need birds. Big ones." He picked up his phone. "I know a guy. He's not nice, but he flies." The guy's name was Jean-Luc. He was a Frenchman who had flown for the Foreign Legion and now flew things for money. He met them at a dockside bar that smelled of salt and diesel. He had a calm, weary face and eyes that missed nothing. "Two C-130 Hercules," Maya said, feeling the absurdity of the words as she said them. "We need to lease them. For a week." Jean-Luc took a slow sip of his beer. "You are not a shipping company," he stated. "No." "You have money?" "Some, not enough." This was the second, bigger rule. The funding. Back in Washington, she had accessed an old, dormant State Department accounted fund for a community aid project that had been canceled years ago, but never formally closed. The paperwork trail was a labyrinth. With a combination of forged signatures, misdirected approvals, and digital sleight of hand, she had diverted the funds. It was a massive crime, a federal offense that would guarantee decades in prison. She felt a physical nausea every time she thought about it. But the number in the account was the only number big enough to even start this conversation. Jean-Luc named a price. It was exorbitant. Maya nodded. She had just enough. The planes are Ukrainian. Old, but tough. "Like me," Jean-Luc said. "They are in Algeria right now. We can have them here in 3 days. But the paperwork." He shook his head. "Flight plans, permits, manifests. For what you want to do, there is no real paperwork. Only the kind that looks real." This became Maya's world. She rented a cheap room with a weak internet connection and worked. Using State Department templates, she created false end-user certificates, making it look like the planes were chartered by a fictional mining company for geographical survey work. She forged airspace permits for countries they would never actually fly over. She wrote manifests listing the medical supplies, ammunition, and survival gear as drilling equipment and personnel effects. Tom handled the physical side. He bribed a port official to look the other way while the pallet of trauma kits, antibiotics, and 4 fluids was loaded onto a truck. He sourced MREs and water from the local black market, paying in cash from Maya's dwindling fund. He found fuel drones and arranged for them to be waiting at remote, unofficial airstrips along a potential route dot. It was a house of cards. Any single official, any curious customs agent, any military radar operator who decided to pick up a phone would bring it all crashing down. The worst moments were the silences. Waiting for Jean-Luc to call. Waiting for a signal from the encrypted satellite phone she bought. The one tuned to the frequency Ben from the NSA had subtly hinted at. She would lie awake at night, the ceiling fan circling uselessly above her, and the fear would wash over her. She wasn't a field operative. She was a paper pusher. She was in over her head, committing crimes that terrified her, risking her entire future for a whisper and the feeling in her gut. One night, the satellite phone buzzed. It wasn't a voice. It was a burst of encrypted text, a data packet that took her computer an hour to decode. When it finally resolved, it was just a set of geographical coordinates and 2 words. Rainfall confirmed. 40% strength. Holding. Rainfall. The corporal in the hospital had mentioned that. A code word. The coordinates were in the border highlands. The 40% strength was devastating. It meant they were down to about 140 effectives. The others were wounded, dead, or missing. But they were holding. They were alive. And they were waiting. She printed the coordinates. The paper trembled in her hand. This was it. The thin, fragile thread connecting her insanity to their reality. She wasn't imagining it anymore. The next morning, Jean-Luc called. The planes had landed at a private, dusty strip outside the city. He needed final flight plans. Maya spread her forged documents out on the bed. This was the final rule, the biggest one. She was creating a fictional flight path for a rescue mission her government had abandoned. She was authorizing a mission that didn't exist. With a deep breath that did nothing to calm her nerves, she signed the final document with a false name. The ink on the paper felt like a point of no return. The bureaucracy had been her life. Now, she was using its own tools to gut it from the inside. The plan was set. The cards were stacked, trembling in the wind. All that was left was to try and make them fly. The airfield was not an airfield. It was a long, straight stretch of cracked tarmac road, built years ago for a farm project that never happened, now lost in the tall grass of the Guinean countryside. Under the dense, starless sky, it felt like the edge of the world. The only light came from the red glow of cigarette tips and the faint, ghostly beams of flashlights covered in red cloth. Maya stood shivering, though the night was warm. The 2 C-130 Hercules were not beautiful planes. They were hulking, angular shapes in the dark, their gray paint blotched and worn. They looked like tired old workhorses. Jean-Luc's crew moved around them in near silence, loading the last of the supplies, the crates of medical gear, the water, the boxes of ammunition. They were a mixed group, a few other former soldiers, a couple of mechanics who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. All paid from the money Maya had stolen. Jean-Luc walked over to her, his face lit from below by his flashlight. "We are ready," he said, his voice flat. "The route is optimistic. We will fly low through valleys to avoid radar. Where there is no valley, we will pray." He handed her a heavy, bulky headset. "You are coming. You paid. And if this is a trap, you will be in the plane with us." Maya put the headset on. The world shrank to the sound of her own breathing. Inside the belly of the lead plane, the noise was a living thing. It was a deafening, all-consuming roar of 4 massive propellers and the scream of wind against the fuselage. The plane shuddered and bounced as it thundered down the makeshift runway, the wheels fighting the broken surface. Maya was strapped into a fold-down seat against the cold metal wall, facing the cavernous, dark, empty space of the cargo hold. She could feel the moment the weight left the wheels, a lurch in her stomach as the old plane clawed its way into the black sky dot. There were no windows for her to see out of. Her world was the dim red interior light, the strained faces of the loadmasters, and the crackle in her headset. Turning to heading 090, descending to 500 feet. The pilot's voice was calm, a strange, robotic comfort in the chaos dot, flying at 500 feet in a large aircraft. In mountainous terrain at night was an act of madness. The plane seemed to buck and dive with every current of air. They were not flying over the landscape. They were fighting their way through it, the shadows of jagged peaks rising like teeth on either side. Every few minutes, a voice would call out from the cockpit. "Heat signature, 10 o'clock. Small village. No activity. Scanning for radar pulses. All clear for now. Turbulence. Hold on. Maya's hands were clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. This was her plan. These men, this risk, this deafening, shuddering machine, it was all because of a decision she had made at a desk thousands of miles away. The weight of it pressed on her, heavier than the G-force in a tight turn. If they were shot down, it was on her. If they crashed, it was on her. If they found nothing but an empty jungle, it was on her. Hours bled together. The headset crackled to life with a different voice. It was Jean-Luc, flying the second plane behind them. Maya, check your terminal. Incoming. Fumbling with a small, rugged laptop tethered to the plane system, she saw it. A new data packet, decrypted automatically. It was a new set of coordinates just 30 miles ahead. And a new message. Rainfall. On the road. Lights ready. Haste. They were ready. They had found a road. They had lights. 5 minutes. The loadmaster yelled over the engine noise, moving to the rear of the plane. He and another crewman began cranking open the giant rear ramp. The roar of the engine swelled into a terrifying hurricane. Cold, damp night air whipped into the hold, swirling papers and dust. Maya could see nothing outside but utter blackness. Then, a faint, tiny pattern of lights flickered below. Not electric lights. Smaller moving. Flashlights. Lanterns. Arranged in two rough, parallel lines on the ground. A desperate makeshift runway guide. There. She screamed, but her voice was lost. The plane banked sharply, circling. The pilot's voice was tense now. Seeing muzzle flashes on the perimeter. They are not alone down there. One pass only. Make it fast. The C-130 straightened, dropping lower. The jungle was a dark mass just below them. The string of guiding lights rushed towards the plane. The impact was brutal. The wheels hit the broken asphalt of the old road with a jarring, screeching smash that sent shocks up Maya's spine. The pilot stood on the brakes. The engine screamed in reverse pitch. Everything in the hold strained against its straps. They were down, hurtling through the night on a road that was too short. Surrounded by jungle. As they slowed, the scene outside the ramp came into view. It was a vision from another world. From the tree line, figures emerged. Not neat lines of soldiers, but ghosts. Men and women in torn and filthy uniforms, their faces gaunt and streaked with dirt. They moved with a desperate discipline, half carrying, half dragging litters bearing wounded comrades. They sprinted from the cover of the trees towards the yawning mouth of the plain, and the jungle itself was alive with light. Not guiding lights anymore, but the quick, sharp flashes of gunfire. Tracers cut red and green lines through the darkness, aimed at the tree line from where the Marines were emerging. The Marines were firing back, a rear guard action, covering their own retreat to the plain. A loadmaster grabbed Maya's arm, pointing. Stay belt on. He mouthed out. She watched, frozen, as the first Marines stumbled up the ramp. Their eyes were wide, hollow with exhaustion, but they scanned the hold, securing it, helping their wounded deeper inside. They didn't look at her. They were still in their mission. A man with a bloody bandage around his head directed traffic. Wounded to the front. Ammo here. Move. The firing from outside intensified. Something pinged against the fuselage. The loadmasters, now joined by Marines inside, fired back from the ramp with mounted guns, the sound deafening even over the engines. And then she saw him. A tall figure, helping a limping Marine up the ramp. It was Colonel Shaw. His uniform was a map of mud and tears, but his posture was rigid, his head on a swivel, counting his people. His eyes met hers for a split second. There was no surprise in them, just a fierce, desperate acknowledgement. He gave a sharp nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was a report. Asterisk, we are here. Now get us out. Asterisk, ramp closing. A loadmaster screamed. The last Marine tumbled in. The colonel gave one last look into the darkness, then shouted, all accounted for. Go, go, go. The massive hydraulic ramp began to rise, cutting off the view of the flashing jungle. The pilots pushed the throttles forward before it was even sealed. The plane, overloaded, strained against its brakes. Then it was moving, bouncing, racing back down the shot-up road towards the black sky. The wheels left the ground just as the trees at the end of the road rushed to meet them. For a heart-stopping second, branches scraped and slammed against the underside of the fuselage. Then they were climbing. The sound of gunfire was gone, replaced again by the pure, shaking roar of the engines working at their limit. In the red light, Marines slumped against the walls, tending to their wounded, drinking water handed to them by the crew. No one cheered. The air was thick with relief, exhaustion, and a shock that was too deep for words. Maya unclipped her belt and moved shakily to where Colonel Shaw was kneeling beside a wounded man, applying pressure to a bandage. He looked up as she approached. The other plane? He asked, his voice raw. Behind us. They're loading now on the next pass, she said. He just nodded again, his focus returning to his soldier. But he reached out and gripped her wrist for a second. His hand was shaking. The grip said what words couldn't. The orders had finally come. They were going home. The flight out was a strange, suspended quiet, filled with a noise that was more than sound. It was the deep, shuddering rumble of the engines, the moans of the wounded, and the thick silence of pure exhaustion. In the dim red light of the cargo hold, Marines slumped against the fuselage, their eyes closed or staring blankly at nothing. Some drank water slowly, methodically, as if remembering how. Others tended to their buddies, checking bandages, whispering reassurances. The smell was a mix of sweat, blood, antiseptic, and jungle damp. Maya moved among them, not as a leader, but as a helper, passing out foil blankets and more water. She avoided their eyes, feeling like an intruder in their private world of survival. They didn't know her. They just knew the plane had come. Colonel Shaw was everywhere and nowhere. He would crouch beside a wounded corporal for 10 minutes, then move to the cockpit to speak with the pilots, then check on the men by the ramp. His authority was a quiet, steady hum that seemed to calm the very air. When he finally sat, leaning back against a crate, he closed his eyes for just a moment. Maya sat down nearby, not speaking. After a while, without opening his eyes, he said, "The fuel stop." "Where?" "A place in the middle of the ocean," Maya replied, her voice hoarse. "An old refueling track. A ship will meet us. Then Brazil. Not the States." He nodded, a faint, grim understanding on his face. "Of course." No official welcome. They refueled in a heart-stopping maneuver over the dark Atlantic, a tanker plane appearing out of the gloom like a phantom, its hoses connecting to theirs as both aircraft roared through the night sky. Jean-Luc had arranged it, another expensive, off-the-books miracle. Then they flew on, the sky eventually softening from black to gray to a pale, watery blue. The coastline of Brazil emerged, green and vast. They landed at a small, private airfield used mostly for cargo, a place where money ensured no questions were asked. As the ramp lowered, bright sunlight flooded the hold, making everyone blink. The warmth that washed in was clean, different from the clinging jungle heat, and then she saw them. On the tarmac, held back by a small, nervous-looking local security team, was a crowd. Not officials. Families. Wives, husbands, parents, children. They must have been flown in secretly. Another part of the Whisper network Maya never knew was working. They were holding signs, their faces etched with an agony of hope. The Marines saw them. The stillness in the hold broke. A choked sob came from somewhere, then another. The exhaustion fell away, replaced by a trembling, disbelieving urgency. They helped each other up, supporting the wounded, and began to walk down the ramp into the light. The scene that followed was not orderly. It was a messy, human explosion of joy and tears. Soldiers stumbled into the arms of sobbing loved ones, collapsing to their knees, burying their faces in their children's hair. The quiet, hardened Marines broke apart, their faces crumpling as they held their families. The sound was not cheering, but a raw mixture of crying, laughter, and the repeated words, "You're home. You're really home." Maya stood at the top of the ramp, watching, her hand over her mouth. This was the picture she had carried in her mind through all the forgeries and the fear. This was the reason. She felt a deep, settling peace, even as her own future remained a terrifying blank. Colonel Shaw was the last one off. He walked slowly down, straightening his torn uniform as best he could. He was immediately surrounded by his officers, by families slapping his back, by kids looking up at him with wide eyes. He accepted it all with quiet grace. Then he turned and looked back up the ramp at Maya. He saluted her. Not a casual wave, but a full, sharp, formal salute, held for a long 3 seconds. She had no rank for him to salute. She was a civilian. She was a criminal. But she understood. She nodded, her vision blurring. The peace lasted until the American jets arrived. 2 sleek fighter planes screamed overhead in a show of force, followed by an unmarked black helicopter that landed roughly on a far corner of the tarmac. Men in dark suits and military police armbands stepped out, their faces stern. They walked straight past the reunions, up the ramp, and directly to Maya. "Maya Vance?" The lead one said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Yes. You are under arrest for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the Espionage Act, misappropriation of federal funds, and about 17 other charges we'll detail later." He took her arm. There was no drama, no scene. The families, absorbed in their joy, barely noticed as she was led, handcuffed, across the tarmac and into the dark belly of the helicopter. The helicopter flew to a large U.S. military base in Florida. Her processing was cold and efficient. They took her fingerprints, her photograph, put her in a holding cell. The silence here was worse than any noise. It was the sound of the machine she had defied, grinding into motion against her days turned into weeks. Her court-martial was prepared. The evidence was overwhelming. Her own forged documents were the prosecution's star exhibits. She met with a tired military defense lawyer who laid out the bleak reality. She was facing life in prison. And then something began to shift. It started in the press. The story had broken, not as a scandal, but as a legend. The raid that didn't exist. One headline read, 340 forgotten Marines mysteriously home. The journalist she had spoken to had done her job, weaving together a story that highlighted the abandonment and the unsanctioned miracle. The families of the Marines became a powerful voice. They wrote letters, gave interviews, petitioned Congress. Colonel Shaw, now debriefed and cleared, was called to testify before a closed congressional committee. He was asked, point blank, if Maya Vance's actions had compromised national security. He looked at the panel of politicians, his back straight. "She responded to a direct order, sirs," he said, his voice clear. "An order from whom?" "From the United States Marine Corps," he said. "One we recite often, to never leave a Marine behind." That order was neglected. She chose not to neglect it. I and 339 others are here because of that choice. The political pressure became a storm. The official story of unrecoverable assets now seemed not just cold, but cowardly. The government, facing a public relations disaster of its own making, began to look for a way out. One morning, her lawyer came in looking baffled. The charges, they're being dropped. What? All of them. In the interest of national morale, and with consideration for the unique circumstances, they're giving you a dishonorable discharge from federal service and calling it even. It wasn't victory. It was a burial. Her career, her reputation in official circles, was ash. She was released quietly from the base, giving back her civilian clothes and a bus ticket. She had no job, no savings, and a name that would forever be whispered about in the halls of government. She rented a small apartment in a town far from Washington. The quiet was different now. It was her own. One afternoon, she received a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It was a grainy, blown-up image taken from a distance at the Brazilian airfield. It showed the moment the Marines had spilled out onto the tarmac, the blur of reunions. On the back, in neat block letters, it said, ***, the promise. Kept DS***. She put the photo on her small fridge, held by a magnet. She made a pot of coffee and sat at her kitchen table, looking out the window at the ordinary street. She had set out to bring them home, thinking home was a place, a set of coordinates on a map. But as she watched those Marines cling to their families, she realized home wasn't a country or a base. It was a state of return. It was being where someone is waiting for you. The system had cast her out for remembering a promise. The system itself had forgotten. She had no pension, no title, no future in the world she knew. But she had a photograph on a fridge. And in the quiet of her own kitchen, for the first time since she'd heard that last crackle of radio static, Maya Vance felt like she, too, had finally returned.